But I asked him first about the disruption which is likely when the new trade arrangements with the EU come into force on Thursday night.
One of the things that is great about this free trade deal, as you say, is that we don't have tariffs, we don't have quotas, we've got a good relationship with our friends in Europe. But it's also the case that Brexit means, as well as new opportunities, some specific challenges. Because outside the single market and outside the customs union, there are new customs procedures that companies that are exporting into Europe need to be familiar with. We've been working with business throughout the year because whether or not we had a free trade agreement, we were always going to be outside the customs union and the single market. So business knew a significant amount of what was required. Now that we've got the deal in place, we're working more intensively with business in order to make sure that everyone is ready for the new opportunities and indeed challenges that come after the 1st of January.
Well, are you confident that businesses are ready? I mean, obviously, they're looking at what is now in place, going through the details. I mean, you've said earlier on that perhaps, companies are going to need to employ a customs administrator. I mean, are businesses actually ready for this in 4 days?
Yes, I think the overwhelming majority of businesses have been getting ready, absolutely. And we're there to help businesses to be ready for, as I say, both the new opportunities, but also the particular new procedures that they face as well. And when it comes to customs, the sector that helps people to fill in those customs forms has grown significantly. And the last survey of how well prepared that particular part of business was showed that there'd been a fourfold increase in their ability to be able to deal with new customs procedures. So, yes, I think business is broadly in a good place, but inevitably, with any change, with any transition, there are occasional bumpy moments, and that's what a government is there to help business to be ready.
Oh, government promised 20,000 new customs officers. I mean, you've had plenty of time to prepare. Are all of those people in place?
Well, again, there's a distinction between the people who man our border force, and we've increased the numbers of people who work for border force. But it's also the case that for those who are at the heart of our economy, for those businesses that export to Europe and indeed beyond, what they tend to do is either have in-house capacity or they go to third parties, to people who are customs specialists. And those customs specialists have indeed been increasing their numbers. And we've given some government money in order to help them to train more people.
Yeah, where are we, though, in terms of that 20,000 figure that the government specifically pointed out?
Well, I don't recall that 20,000 figure specifically. What I do recall is speculation, of course, over the additional number of people who'd be required to be customs intermediaries, and there was a range of figures. Some are actually estimating that we needed more than that. What we do know is that the industry itself has increased in size, a sort of fourfold increase, according to the latest information that we have, which should be sufficient to deal with the process as we leave the customs union and the single market in the course of the next few days. Of course, one of the things that the UK government's done in order to help business is to phase in our own import procedures. So while it is the case that Europe will be asking certain things of our businesses, we won't be asking anything of our own businesses additional to what they have at the moment for a good few months yet.
What about tourists? Because obviously the business is hugely important, but there are more tourists heading out to Europe, of course, than hopefully next year than we've seen in a while.
So. Yes.
Fingers crossed. What are we going to have to do?
Well, the key thing there is to make sure that your passport is up to date. It's vitally important to make sure that there are more than 6 months on your passport in order to be able to travel. But you should be able to travel freely in Europe. And the rules broadly are that you can spend up to 90 days in Europe during any 180-day period. So that means that people can have, well, quite leisurely holidays in Europe in an uninterrupted way. But of course, as you quite rightly point out, we need to make sure that we deal with the COVID pandemic effectively first.
Yeah, EHIC, the European Health Card, I mean, that's all gone then now. It's all down to our own insurance, is it?
Well, it is important that people take out insurance, but it's also the case that there will be, as I've mentioned before, a specific provision for people who do have very serious ailments. So there will be a successor to the EHIC card, which makes sure that those people for whom health insurance would always be a difficult thing can have their healthcare covered. And of course, people who are currently resident in the EU EU who are British, and there are around 1 million of those. They have, under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, access to e-HIC cards as well.
What about these issues that are still to be resolved? And there are plenty of them. I mean, the Home Secretary saying, the UK will be more secure after Brexit. I mean, that can't be right, can it? We haven't sorted out security. We haven't got something, to replace the Schengen information system for a kick-off.
Well, that's the one system that we won't have access to. We will have access to a variety of systems, passenger name records, criminal records, and so on. But it's also the case, we were talking earlier about the people who man our border force. They will have new powers and new abilities to be able to make sure that our borders are policed more effectively in the future. And the Home Secretary is quite right to point out that countries that have effective control of their borders are better able to protect their own people.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can say that is one system that we haven't sorted out yet, but it is a system that British police access, on average, 1.65 million times every single day. That's going to leave a pretty big hole until we get something to replace it.
Well, there are other ways in which we share information with our friends in Europe. There are a number of different ways, and the treaty that we've signed, the deal that we've signed, has detailed provisions for making sure that we can share confidential information between ourselves. But one of the things about the specific system is that in order to accept that system, in order to be in that system, we had to accept the fact that the European Court could rule in our own country. And one of the points about Brexit is to be able to take back control of our laws, and indeed by taking back control of our laws and our borders, as the Home Secretary has quite rightly said, we can make ourselves safer.
What's happening with the services sector as well? Because the services sector doesn't seem to be covered by this trade agreement, yet it makes up 80% of our economy. So it seems to leave some very big questions for city banks, for insurance companies, for accounting firms who don't know what their path forward is going to be at this stage.
Well, there are some details on services. It's a 1,246-page document, and it deals with lots of issues, but it also does deal with services. And it is clear that when it comes to legal services, solicitors and barristers can continue to practice in Europe, and it also makes it clear that there is a new basis on which financial services can operate. And as the Chancellor of the Exchequer was pointing out yesterday, we were told years ago that the very act of voting for Brexit would mean a massive migration of jobs from the city. That has not happened. And in fact, there are ways in which we can regulate our financial services in a smarter way in order to ensure, for example, that it's easier for companies to list here in the UK. So, of course, we want to make sure that we support financial and other services in the future. But it's not just about trade with the EU. It's about making sure that our domestic regulation is better designed in order to ensure that more people invest in this country.
But that seems to leave the point that, although we like to think all is done with the EU in terms of negotiations, at least we do on this side of things, everyone's had enough of talking about it. There's clearly a lot more still to talk about. I mean, all these issues, transferable professional skills, all need to be looked at. I mean, there's still quite a long way to go, isn't there?
Well, it is the case that governments are always talking to one another to see how they can cooperate better. That's just a factor of life. But the big political battles over Brexit, I think, are settled now. That was what the Prime Minister promised in the general election last December. He said we'd get Brexit done. We all remember how painful the Parliament that ran from 2017 to 2019 was, with all sorts of wrangles and late-night cliffhanger votes. Well, that's done. Boris got us out of the European Union on January. He got a great trade deal just before Christmas. That means that we can look forward with confidence. And yeah, it's always the case that that governments are making sure that their relations with friends and neighbours are kept in good repair. But the big arguments over Brexit, they're now resolved.
Can I ask about fishing? Because it was the fishing industry was actually a key factor in pushing for Brexit. We know that the fishing industry were very pro-Brexit. I mean, you're from a fishing family. We know that. You've got a vested interest in all of this. I mean, there does seem to be a huge amount of disappointment in the fishing sector that you've, as they see it, sold them down the river to an extent.
Well, I do sympathise with people in the fishing sector because, again, life in the common fisheries policy has been very, very difficult. But we're out of the common fisheries policy now. It is the case that under this deal, we increase the amount of fish in our own waters that we can catch. Beforehand, we could only catch about half of the value of the fish in our waters. Now, we can go on to catch 2/3. And indeed, in 5 years' time, we'll be able to catch even more. So, of course, we would like to have been in a position where it was only 3 years before we could exercise those additional rights. The EU were originally saying it would have to be 14 years. So we got them down from 14 to 5.5. And, of course, at the end of those 5.5 years, we'll have total control.
Can we talk COVID, if you would? Because obviously, I mean, it's still a huge issue. The numbers are still going up. There's a huge amount of concern. We don't know quite what's going to happen in the new year in terms of further lockdowns or extending lockdowns, whatever it may be. What is happening with schools? It is an issue on which the clock is very much ticking now.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the first thing to say is that our plan is that primary schools will go back, but with secondary schools, it will be the case that next week only children in year 11 and year 13, that's those who are doing their GCSEs, their BTECs, their A-levels, those will go back, and also children of key workers and children who are vulnerable and who need the support and care that school can provide. Other children in secondary schools won't go back for a week after that.
So just 1 week, is that flexible at this stage, depending on the science?
Well, we always keep things under review, but teachers and head teachers have been working incredibly hard, over the Christmas period since schools broke up, in order to prepare for a new testing regime, community testing, in order to make sure that children and all of us are safer. So we do keep things under review, but that is the plan.
OK, so just to clarify, secondary school children, unless they're in years 11 and 13 or years 11 to 13, unless they're in those years, they won't go back.
Years 11 and year 11 and year 13. So if you're doing GCSEs, BTECs, A-levels, and you're sitting them this year, or 2021, I should say, then you are supposed to be going back in the week of the 4th. And of course, if your mum or dad is a key worker, or if you're one of those vulnerable children who have been identified and who are better supported by being in school, then you should go back. Other children will be taught remotely and will have to wait for another week before going back.
Are schools prepared for that, do you think?
Well, they've been preparing very hard over the course of the holidays, and I just think we should all be very grateful for the fact that teachers, at the end of what has been a very difficult and challenging year, played a brilliant role in making sure that children could go back to school, and they've been preparing for this. The government is talking to heads and to teachers at the moment in order to make sure that we can support them to get children back.
You're talking about the children going back on the 4th who are preparing for GCSEs or preparing for A-levels. Does that mean you are expecting exams to go ahead in the summer?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Despite the fact that's not happening I don't think it's Scotland, they're not doing exams, are they? Why is it the case that in England you want those exams to go ahead?
Exams are critically important in making sure that students have a chance to show what they've learned and what their skills are, and they're an important objective test. And again, the Scottish Government will make its own decisions, but it's vitally important that children have an opportunity to sit those examinations in order to have robust, independently scrutinised qualifications that are a passport to a better future.
There's a lot of hope pinned on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. I know you can't comment as to whether that's going to be approved this week, because that's up to the MHRA, but there's an awful lot of expectation that it will be, an awful lot of hope hanging on that. Is Rishi Sunak right when he talks about, the possibility of lifting restrictions in February if all this comes to pass? Because that almost seems to be ignoring the huge complications which there are going to be, the logistical problems in getting that rolled out.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's a very good explanation. The first thing is we have to wait until the independent regulator deems whether or not the vaccine is ready and safe to use. If it is the case, then the government is prepared to ensure that we have a significant increase in the way in which the vaccine is rolled out. And the Chancellor is right as well. If we do get the authorisation for that vaccine and the rollout goes according to plan, then we will be able progressively to lift some of the restrictions which have made life so difficult for so many.
I just wonder if it's problematic to talk about timelines at this stage when, on one hand, the government talks timelines, but you also talk about the need for this absolute flexibility, which I think people do understand.
Yes, I think you're right. I think people do understand. I think the right balance is the one that the Chancellor struck yesterday, which is to outline a hopeful path to the future, but to stress, as you've quite rightly done, that it's contingent on certain things, including the authorisation of the vaccine proceeding as we hope. People want to have a clear sense of what the exit strategy is, but people are also very understanding that events and circumstances which none of us can necessarily foresee can sometimes delay or frustrate the progress that we all want to make.